SpongeBob, have you finished swabbing the deck?
Almost. There's a nasty barnacle under table 9.
Holy shit, everyone! Team Plasma from Pokémon Black and White is the Soviet Union, and the entire game is a sharp commentary on the Russian Revolution. I'm serious! Now, I know what you're thinking. Really, Timmy? Team Plasma, the bad guys from Pokémon Black and White, a children's game meant for little babies and man-babies, is the Soviet Union? You're telling me that this supposed animal trafficking game is Nintendo's way of critiquing the Russian Revolution and the birth of the red superpower? How much crack have you been smoking that led you down this rabbit hole? Yes to all these questions. You see, believe it or not, Nintendo is one of, if not the most anti-authoritarian, anti-dictator, punk rock, fuck-the-man video game companies of all time. Think about it. What are all their games about? No, I don't mean their stories or their plots. I mean really think about what their games are about. That's right, anti-authoritarianism and freedom. Every single game that Nintendo has produced has been about authoritarianism. Every single piece of art has been a statement from Miyamoto and Reggie about how the fascists and dictators that rule this world, both now and before, are nothing more than disgusting pigs who only care about power and status, and so must be stopped to preserve freedom and democracy. Think about it. Mario is an Italian freedom fighter attempting to overthrow this universe's version of Benito Mussolini, represented excellently by Bowser, King of the Koopas, and restore the Italian Republic with Princess Peach as its rightful president. The Legend of Zelda series is about a brave soldier who must battle against an evil warlock whose entire existence is based on the Demon King's hatred for those with, quote, the blood of the goddess and the spirit of the hero. Sound like anyone you know? Splatoon is a perfect representation of the British punk bands like The Clash and the Sex Pistols that formed as a way of telling Margaret Thatcher and the establishment to go fuck themselves. The point is, if you couldn't tell, Nintendo is the based symbol of freedom. They were woke before these dumb nerds could even say the word woke when they were still shitting their little gamer brain diapers. They're so left-wing that it makes AOC blush like a cute anime girl. So, it would make sense why Pokémon, the beloved children's animal captivity and gladiator game, would not be immune to Nintendo's inclusion of anti-authoritarian pro-freedom metaphors. From the series' very existence, these games have always been about freedom. Think about it. What other video game series would feature stories where parents would willingly, or neglectfully, take your pick, allow their 10-year-old children to run around freely in the wild catching yellow rats and use their captured animals to beat up other people's animals for money? No other game except maybe Nintendogs, which, may I remind you, is another game developed by, you guessed it, Nintendo. So at this point you're probably thinking, Timmy, okay, so maybe Nintendo is the wokest company in the world, and maybe Pokemon is about freedom, but how does this have anything to do with Team Plasma and the Soviet? Shut up, nerd, I'm getting to that. Hold your horses, Jesus. Now you see, while Pokemon has always been about freedom, it's not the only theme that these games explore in detail, as this franchise has another thematic element that is a favorite of Nintendo's, and that's the resistance against pro-fascist and pro-authoritarian rule. Now for those who don't know, each game in the mainline Pokemon series has had a group of bad guys that has some sort of desire to take over the world in some way. Team Rocket wanted to steal and capture rare Pokemon using the power of gambling and really stupid spinning mazes in an attempt to take over the world. Team Magma wanted to use Groudon's power to turn the entire world into a desert drier than your mom's vagina. Team Aqua wanted to use Kyogre's power to turn the entire world into a vast ocean wetter than your girlfriend's vagina. What do these criminal organizations slash terrorist groups have in common with Mussolini, Hitler, Francisco Franco, Ron DeSantis, Dean Pelton, and the rest of history's most famous dictators? They desire two things: absolute power and complete subservience of the entire world. Each mainline Pokemon game has had these group of villains and bad guys who will stop at nothing to achieve their authoritarian goals, and yet every time they are defeated and disbanded by the main character, this 10-year-old symbol of freedom, this powerful beacon of democracy. Because freedom always prevails, and while this message has been prevalent in every mainline Pokemon game, Nintendo has been unfortunately too subtle, too discreet when communicating this message. They thought the fans would pick up on it, but like with most most things in life, these important political messages went over their heads. So, Nintendo and Pokemon director Junichi Masuda said no more. The people, the kids, the children, the neckbeards living in their parents' basement, more than ever need to hear these messages about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They need to inspire the next generation of gamers to revolt against their potential power-hungry overlords and tell them that they will no longer walk over us and spout their bullshit like we're stupid. They needed to make a statement, and what way to make such a statement than by critiquing not only arguably one of the most disastrous revolutions, the Russian Revolution, but also specifically the men responsible for creating such a chaotic revolution and the empire that resulted from that revolution, the Soviet Union. Those men are Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, and Leon Trotsky. Now, even if you don't know every single detail about Vladimir Lenin, you at least know who this guy is, or at the very least a vague idea about who this glassesless Walter White is all about. Pro-Marxist revolutionary, led the October and February Revolution, founded the Soviet Union, the Communist Party, yada yada yada, you get it. However, while you might know who this guy is, you might not know who this hippie is. Well, I guess the people who've played Pokemon Black and White know who this is, but whatever, just let me fucking explain. Now, for those of you who are confused, this man is named N, or Natural Harmonia Gropius? The fuck? Whatever, according to Bulbapedia, that's his real name, so let's just roll with it. Anyway, Mr. Gropius here is a character in both Black and White and Black and White 2. According to Bulbapedia, he is, quote, one of the player's rivals, the puppet leader of Team Plasma, and aspires to create separate worlds for humans and Pokemon. Now, at face value, you may be asking, wait a minute, this sounds nothing like Vladimir Lenin, Timmy, you're full of shit. And sure, while N is neither bald nor has this sexy goatee that makes every woman within a 50-mile range drop their panties, nor does he spout any of Lenin's political, social, or economic thoughts, but these are insignificant details because when you dig deeper, you realize that Lenin and N are linked in exactly two ways. They are driven by idealism, and they are traumatized by their youths. You see, according to Bulbapedia, when N was a young kid, he was orphaned and left in the woods. There he was raised by Pokemon, thereby cementing the crucial relationship between N and Pokemon. You see, to N, Pokemon weren't just pets or pals that you could just bring along to supposedly what every girl on Tinder supposedly wants, and that's, quote, going on an adventure. To N, Pokemon were his closest loved ones, his best friends, his family, the beings he could rely on no matter what. And this relationship only further cemented when he was adopted by Ghetsis, a man who not only claimed to be his father, but also raised him to be the future king of Team Plasma. To ensure that N becomes the king, Ghetsis not only raised him together with Pokemon, but he also isolated him from having any contact with humans. The only time Ghetsis would allow N to interact with humans was by purposely putting him in positions where he watched Pokemon get hurt and abused by humans. N's limited, narrow-minded experience with humans caused him to grow up resenting humanity, eventually avoiding all contact in general. That is, until N became around 16 to 20. It's not exactly clear how old N is in any of these games though, but that's a rough estimate, where N would go on his little adventure interacting with the player and spouting his beliefs of Pokemon liberation whenever and wherever he could, before eventually becoming the king of Team Plasma. You see, N was driven by one goal, and that's to free all Pokemon from humans. He didn't believe in a world where humans and Pokemon could live side by side. He believed that Pokemon have been, and ultimately will always be, slaves to humanity, and that even if there were supposed, quote, good trainers that still treated their Pokemon equally, they still did not justify Pokemon being forced to the will of trainers, to bow down to the words of their masters. This is why N was so driven to become the hero of the Unova legend, so that he could free Pokemon and liberate them from their chains, or in this case, their Pokeballs. To serve as a symbol for all Pokemon to join him in his revolution against humanity, and while I'm no mind reader or fortune teller, I can safely assume that if Lenin were playing this game for nerds and children, he would cry, "Oh my god, that's literally me," whenever N showed up, because when examining N's character in this way, there is certainly a lot in N that Lenin would be able to relate to, and maybe even see in himself. You see, despite what many may assume, Lenin didn't actually start out as a revolutionary little scamp who was spouting death to capitalism the moment he could speak for the first time. In fact, if you research his childhood, you'd think that he'd have the very opposite beliefs. For those who don't know, Lenin's parents were actually monarchists and liberal conservatives who avoided political radicals as they were committed to the emancipation reform of 1861, introduced by Tsar Alexander II. Far from the crazy radical household, and aside from the occasional misbehavior that every child has, Lenin grew up a relatively normal kid. Unfortunately, that normal behavior didn't last long, as two tragic deaths occurred in his life that changed him to become the man we know him as today. When Lenin was 15 years old, his father died of a brain hemorrhage, and this death was so tragic that he renounced his belief in God and became more erratic and confrontational. At the age of 15, may I remind you. However, that's nothing compared to what happened to his brother, Alexander, who at around the same time was studying at St. Petersburg University and was involved in a radical political group dead set in overthrowing and destroying the absolute monarchy of Tsar Alexander III. He joined a revolutionary cell bent on assassinating the Tsar and even attempted to build a bomb, but before the attack could take place, the conspirators were arrested and the group, along with Alexander, were hung to death. Lenin was emotionally traumatized by the death of his family, and this pushed him to continue studying, graduate at the top of his class, and attend law school where he would be introduced to all the political theorists and writers that attracted his brother, with one writer that sparked his interest, Karl Marx. Now, I'm not going to go too in-depth about the specific points of communism and Marxism that Lenin found attractive because this isn't a history or political economics video, but I will say that when reading Marx's Communist Manifesto, Lenin found two ideas attractive. Class struggle and the capitalist society would eventually transition into a socialist and then communist society. This set the groundwork for not just the foundational principles of Lenin as a man, but the main principles that would become Lenin's Communist Party and the Soviet Union. You see, Lenin, like N, was driven by idealism. Lenin argued that the Russian proletariat, which, for those who don't know, is the working class, would develop class consciousness, and in turn would lead them to violently overthrow the Tsarism and the bourgeoisie, and create a new utopia where the proletariat can live in peace and harmony without the rich and wealthy shitting on their parade. Now, obviously, Lenin's beliefs go way deeper than that, but the point is that Lenin, like N, was driven by his ideals and creating a utopian society meant for a specific group of beings who he felt were being abused and dominated by another group of individuals. And so he felt responsible to be the leader of this movement that, if successful, will create this beautiful ideal world that best suits what Lenin believed to be perfect for the working class, just like how N believed that a world where Pokemon lived freely without humans is the ideal utopian society where they can flourish. These men were traumatized at a young age, and they used their trauma to develop their ideal beliefs. But as the previous Pokemon games in history have showed us, ideals are nothing more than fantasies. The real world does not work or operate the way our fantasies do, and this is something that both Lenin and N are confronted with and frustrated by, and yet they refuse to bend the knee and fully commit to their ideologies, no matter how naive that thinking may be. N and Lenin are one and the same, and Nintendo Masuda did an excellent job creating these parallels. However, when there's idealism, there's also freeloaders, or more specifically, people who take advantage of these fantasies for their own personal gain, and this is where Getsis and Stalin come into play. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, Timmy, maybe you've convinced me that some parallels exist between N and Lenin. Either that, or you're just entirely convinced that I'm an insane sociopath on speed, but same difference. But you can't seriously expect me to believe that this over-the-top evil anime villain is the same as one of history's most notorious, brutal, anti-Semitic, food-hoarding, gulag-building, thick-mustache dictators of all time. And sure, I'll admit, the parallels between Stalin and Getsis are not as strong as N and Lenin. Granted, even despite Nintendo's desire to promote their pro-democracy messages, they still want to ensure that this game was rated E for everyone, so Getsis couldn't exactly send his human and Pokemon enemies into forced labor camps. But this is where Nintendo got sneaky. While on paper Getsis has very little in common with Stalin, they do intertwine in one important way: power-hungry madmen who had the ability to manipulate power right under people's noses. Let me explain. So an important thing to know about Mr. Getsis Harmonia Gropius, Jesus fucking Christ, these names, is that this guy is the adopted father of N, but keep in mind that he didn't adopt him out of the goodness of his heart. Getsis manipulated N by molding him into this ideal figure that Team Plasma could worship and follow. And while Getsis may be one of Team Plasma's 7 sages, he was never fully loyal to Team Plasma's goals of Pokemon liberation. According to Pokemon Wiki, Getsis manipulated N and used Team Plasma for his own selfish purpose to be the only trainer left in the world with Pokemon, thus granting himself the power to become a dictator. So ultimately, while N was technically the leader of Team Plasma, it was really Getsis who was pulling the strings and the organization's true ruler, and this is where Stalin comes into the equation. Now, Lenin was in no way, shape, or form manipulated by anyone when he formed the Communist Party and led his revolutionary movement. Unlike this green-haired dumbass whose manipulation was completely unknown to him, Lenin was smart enough to know how his fellow party members thought and behaved, and this was especially the case with Stalin. Now, while Stalin might not have been the sharpest tool in the shed, Lenin knew that he was still dangerous if given any actual power. So in 1922, when the Communist Party decided to expand the Central Committee, which for those of you who don't know is basically the Soviets' equivalent of the 7 sages from Team Plasma, they created the title of General Secretary. To possibly keep him in check, Lenin appointed Stalin as the General Secretary, and while Stalin was disappointed disappointed for not being given a prestigious title, he soon realized it was a blessing in disguise, as he was able to essentially use this new office to gain massive advantages towards other key persons in the Communist Party. As the General Secretary, he prepared the agenda for the Politburo meetings, directing the course of those conferences, and he also had the power to appoint new local party leaders, thereby establishing a patronage network of people loyal to him. So while Lenin is slightly smarter than this green-haired man-child, he still wasn't smart enough to realize that he stupidly gave Stalin all the power needed to basically become the next leader of the Communist Party. And to make matters worse, in 1922, Lenin suffered a massive stroke that he was never able to recover from, as this would serve as his downfall. Plus, it didn't help that Stalin used this opportunity to effectively cut Lenin off from the party and isolate him, as he was forced to retire his leadership position, something that Getsis did when N loses to the main character. Lenin knew that he was basically fucked in the asshole, so in a last-ditch attempt, he drew up a will that is way too detailed for me to go over for a video about Pokemon and communism, but the thing you need to know about this will is that Lenin basically talked shit about Stalin, specifically how he'd not only make a terrible fucking leader, but that he doesn't have the party's best interests, only caring about himself and satisfying his desire to amass personal power. And so at the end of this will, Lenin calls for the removal of Stalin as General Secretary. However, before Lenin could publish the will, Stalin activated his trap card when he received the will from one of Lenin's secretaries, who was also his agent. Once Stalin got his hands on this document, he basically scrubbed any mention of Lenin talking shit about him and all the other stupid bullshit about him not getting power or whatever, and with the help of his allies, he was able to repress any mention of this document whatsoever. And on top of that, Stalin was given the honor of organizing Lenin's funeral after he died from a heart attack, and so Stalin basically ignored all of Lenin's wishes by not only arranging the funeral, but by giving a speech at his funeral as well. With all this set in motion, on top of essentially getting rid of any political opponent who could pose as a threat to his power, which I'm not going to go in depth because again, it's not relevant and this video is already super long, Stalin became the de facto successor of Lenin, before eventually becoming the sole leader of the Communist Party. Now overall, the moral of this history lesson is that while Stalin and Getsis may not agree on a lot of political and economic issues, mainly because we have no idea what the fuck Getsis believes in besides complete control and authoritative power, something that Stalin can definitely relate to, Stalin and Getsis do share one incredibly important trait: to take power using any ruthless means possible, while also being incredibly sneaky and manipulative, right under your supposed, quote, boss's noses. Stalin and Getsis played Lenin and N like fools, and that is why they are, in this specific way, one and the same. Now, I'm gonna be brief with this one because compared to the other two comparisons, I don't have much to go off since I'm comparing this Russian sexy bastard to a fucking dragon, but hear me out, will ya? This one is just as relevant as the previous ones. So anyway, before I talk about either Trotsky or the legendary dragons, let's go back to N and his shtick. As I mentioned when I was comparing N and Lenin, N wanted to accomplish his dream of liberating Pokemon from their human slavers by creating a utopian society where all Pokemon could flourish without humans, and to do this he needed to be the supposed, quote, hero of the Unova legend. And one thing to keep in mind about this supposed hero of the Unova legend is that they are the only ones who can control the legendary dragon Pokemon Reshiram and Zekrom. Now this is why N gave such a massive shit about being the hero so badly. He knew that in order to make his humanless Pokemon utopia a reality, he could only achieve it by using the power of one of the two legendary dragon Pokemon, depending on which version of the game you're playing. Attaining Reshiram or Zekrom serves as the ultimate culmination of everything he wanted to achieve, and using one of these legendary dragons, he was not only able to live up to his status as the king of Team Plasma, but he was also able to defeat Alder, the champion of the Elite Four and the supposed strongest Pokemon trainer in all of Unova. Zekrom / Reshiram are what allowed N to get as far as he did, and the same can be said about Trotsky. Now, I'm not going to go too in depth about Trotsky himself, his political beliefs, his ambitions, etc. What matters first and foremost was the position he held during the Russian Revolution, specifically during the Russian Civil War, as during this time Trotsky served as the head of the Red Army, the Russian military force that would deliver Mother Russia to Lenin on a silver platter. You see, prior to 1918, Trotsky served as a commissar for foreign affairs, but wanted to recuse himself from this position and instead desired to lead the Red Army, as he believed that the military force should only consist of dedicated revolutionaries and rely on propaganda and force, something that Trotsky had experienced in both of those categories. So, he resigned from his position and was appointed as the People's Commissar of Army and Navy Affairs, before eventually gaining full control of the Red Army itself after abolishing the post of Commander-in-Chief. Now, I'm gonna gloss over the actual conflict fighting related shit between the Red Army and the White Army led by Alexander Kerensky. Since you ever even so much as opened a history textbook, then you know who won this battle. But I will leave it at this. When discussing Trotsky's role in the Russian Civil War, this is what this Russian historian had to say about Trotsky's contributions. Quote, Trotsky bears a great deal of responsibility both for the victory of the Red Army in the Civil War and for the establishment of a one-party authoritarian state with its apparatus for ruthlessly suppressing dissent. He was an ideologist and practitioner of the Red Terror. He despised bourgeois democracy. He believed that spinelessness and soft-heartedness would destroy the revolution. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why Trotsky's equivalent is a fucking legendary Pokemon dragon.
In conclusion,
So yeah, if you haven't figured it out already, Team Plasma from Pokemon Black and White is basically the Soviet Union, and as Vladimir Lenin, Getsis is Joseph Stalin, and Reshiram/Zekrom is Leon Trotsky. Nintendo has continued their tradition of spreading anti-authoritarian and pro-freedom messages in their games, and while Pokemon Black and White continue that tradition, they also stand out because they take a more detailed and unsubtle stance with their messages this time around. You see, compared to the previous Pokemon games, where a lot of their villains have been more or less an amalgamation of famous authoritarian fascists throughout history, Black and White is the first Pokemon game where Nintendo and renowned Pokemon director Junichi Masuda make overt references and representations to specific authoritarian dictators. And if you ask me, it's no coincidence that Masuda chose this specific game, these ruthless rulers, and this specific revolution when it came to outwardly criticizing a specific authoritarian group or person. Because I believe that not only is Pokemon Black and White Masuda's passion project, his swan song, his masterpiece, but it's also his most personal work, because when it comes to history's most brutal and evil empires, Russia seems to affect him the most. Don't believe me? Well, let me leave you with this. Prior to Masuda becoming the director of the Pokemon franchise from Pokemon Crystal to Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, Masuda worked for Game Freak as a composer for the Pokemon series. And if you go to his Wikipedia page when examining his music influences, it says, quote, Masuda's musical style draws from a number of sources, particularly classical music and the works of Igor Stravinsky and Dmitri Shostakovich. Stravinsky and Shostakovich, two Russian composers, but not just any Russians. Russians who were born in and lived during the Soviet Union, who were beloved by the Soviet Union, the very superpower Masuda wanted to break down and criticize.
Coincidence? I think not!